Hey, I'm Jeff from Full-Race, and today we're going to show you how to install the Full-Race Formline Turbo Kit on a Gen 1 3.5 liter EcoBoost engine. Now this right behind me is a 2015-2016, and Gen 1 gets a little confusing because it's in 2011 to 14s, it's in 15 to 16s, it's in Expeditions, Navigators, and they even use it in Transits to today. It's a big job, and so watch this video, and by the end, you're gonna see that it's absolutely doable. While you can follow the factory procedure, you're gonna miss a few tips and tricks that we're gonna show you to make this install as reliable as it possibly can be. There's small things like the oil feed filters that are gonna need to be replaced. The coolant lines, they're notoriously leaky, so we've replaced them entirely. The exhaust manifold studs, Fords are one-time use, so these are Inconel studs, they'll never have to be replaced. We're gonna apply anti-seize to all the hot threaded surfaces, and we're gonna use O-ring lube on all the O-rings. So stick with us, and by the end, you're gonna have a good understanding of what it takes and how to do this job on your own. So let's get into it. Right off the bat, it's really important to start this job on the workbench before you tear into the truck. And the basic layout of this engine is it's a V6 twin turbo, so each bank of 3 cylinders has 1 turbo. So this is the driver's side, this is the passenger side, and you'll see that they're actually mirror images of each other. So the driver's side is a traditional standard clockwise rotation turbo. Passenger side is the exact opposite. It's reverse rotation counterclockwise. If you have an 11 to 12, your blow-off valve is going to be built into the compressor housings. This right here on the Garrett is a blank off plate for the 13 ups. If you have 11 to 12, you'll have a little blow-off valve cap here. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the coolant lines. And it's a little confusing because these coolant lines all pretty much look the same. But it's important to realize that the longest of these coolant lines is actually going to be the passenger side coolant return. And then the second longest, which again, they're very close in length, but the second longest will be your driver's side coolant return. So we'll separate them. Next, we will look at the coolant feeds. And the passenger side coolant feed has 2 90s, a long radius 90 to a short radius 90. So passenger side, but the driver's side in comparison has a 45 to a 90. So it's really important to kind of keep these separate, and they all look similar, but they are different. Next thing we'll take a look at is the Jiffy tight fitting on the turbocharger center sections. And the way Ford has these set up is they are aluminum fitting with an O-ring on the inside. Very common failure point. You can replace these with more OEM parts, but those are also going to fail. So by replacing it entirely, removing this thing entirely, replacing it with a AN flare fitting, we're going to completely eliminate the possibility of a leak ever occurring. We're going to start tearing into the turbos by removing these Jiffy tight fittings and throwing them as far away from us as possible. So 19mm socket, grab my handy dandy Milwaukee, make quick work of this. These things, total headache, avoided at all costs. All right, now, banjo fitting. Again, this is gonna go on the top. We're just gonna finger tighten it in place. We'll tighten that up later on the truck. Just trying to get everything oriented right now. And then on this, we will attach either end of the long 90. You wanna kind of point it toward the turbine housing, as it will be going over the turbo and toward the back of the engine. Next one, we're going to fully tighten this one. Apply some silicone O-ring lube. Carefully apply the silicone O-ring lube all the way around. Do not want to tear an O-ring during an install. And then gently apply the fitting to the center section. And just to be safe, I like to tighten these down by hand. Don't want to just whack it in with the gun. So this is a 19mm socket. Next, we're going to put the oil supply line onto the turbo. And the 45-degree fitting is going to go on the turbo, and the other side will actually point toward the block. So it should look like this, just kind of move them around. Fittings are Teflon sealed. So this driver's side turbo is getting pretty close to being ready. We're going to move over to the passenger side now. So again, we will start with the banjo fitting on top. Keep it finger tight and get ready to lock it down once it's on the engine. The long hose, extra long hose, that again is going to point to the back of the engine, so it's going to go over the turbine housing to the back of the cylinder heads over by the firewall. Again, we'll just keep this one finger tight. Okay, now we're going to move on to the front of the turbo and apply some silicone O-ring lube all the way around the fitting. And then we'll pop it in place. Snug it up. Don't need to go too crazy, it has an O-ring. From here, we have a long radius 90 and a short radius 90. So the long radius 90 will go on the turbo. The short radius 90 is there to clear the AC compressor. It's a real tight fit, and so the long radius 90 is just a little too close. Short radius 90 fits up real nice. So orient it 180 degrees opposite, and this thing's basically ready. We got Corey in the back. He's pulling the front wheels off, giving us a little bit of room to access the turbos. And now he is disconnecting the negative battery terminal using a 10mm socket. Next, we're going to move on to taking off the engine appearance cover. First, Corey will remove the oil fill cap. Then he'll pull the front of the engine cover up about 3 to 4 inches, and you can then yank it toward the front of the truck and the whole cover itself will lift off. Next, he will unscrew the coolant cap and position a drain pan under the truck on the passenger side to drain the coolant. Corey's now pulling out the fender liners to gain access to the side of the engine where the turbochargers are located. We just started tearing into this thing, and no surprise, it has a notorious coolant leak. It's kind of hard to see from the outside of the turbo, but where the coolant is leaking is actually right between the block and the inside of the turbo. So that is the coolant feed line right off of the motor into the turbo. The coolant's like dried up and become crusty. It has these like stalactite formations. So it's really good that we're doing this now. While the coolant's draining, Corey's gonna pull off the skid plate and then drain the oil. Corey's gonna get ready to remove the starter. The starter doesn't have to come out of the vehicle. It just has to be unbolted to provide access to the oil drain. He'll start by using a 10mm socket to remove the transmission cooler line. Then he'll use a 13mm socket to remove the 2 starter bolts, allowing you to push the starter back. You don't have to unplug anything, just move the starter back enough to access the turbocharger's oil drain bolt. Now the skid plates are out, oil's drained, coolant's drained, starter's moved. Corey moved a little bit further back to get the downpipe separated from the turbo. You do not have to remove the downpipe from the vehicle entirely, but it saves a lot of effort, so I think it's a good idea. It's worth a little bit of time. Now Corey is back on top of the engine bay. He'll loosen and work free both the driver and passenger side charge clamps, intake tubes. You have to unseat the mounting tabs for the intake tubes from their rubber bushings, and then he can disconnect the charge pipe couplers. You do not need to remove the charge pipes from the engine bay, only the intake tubes. At this point, most of the exterior teardown is done, and now it's time to focus on the turbos. And we'll start with the cylinder heads coolant return Jiffy Tight fitting. So this is a little spring clip. If it is a 11 to 14, you'll kind of want to come into the top where the intake manifold is. It's a 15, 16, we're going to come in from the opposite side. So driver's side coolant line, come in from the passenger side in the back, get the pick tool under the spring clip, kind of just pop that clip out and get rid of it and pull this out, get that free. Now that the cylinder head Jiffy Tight is loose, we'll come over to the turbo. I just pulled the spring clip out a second ago. This one's a little easier to access, and you got to kind of wiggle this out and get it out of the turbocharger. Throw this thing away, you are not going to need it. Next, we're going to turn our attentions to the combination oil feed, coolant feed, T45 Torx. In this case, we're just going to use the T45. We're going to pull the bolt out, and then the coolant comes loose, and the oil feed's behind it. So Next, we'll come down to the oil drain. Again, this is another T45 Torx. We'll pull this one out, and that's the last bolt we'll need to do for the hard lines. Next, we are going to use a T50 Torx to pull out the turbo to manifold bolts. So T50 Torx, and we'll bang these out. Now that the turbo is fully unbolted, all the hard lines are loose, we can wiggle it out a little carefully and get it out of position. You want to be gentle on this because you do not want to bend your oil feed line, hard line combination. You're going to need to reuse this, or you may need to reuse this depending on whether or not replacing it. Ford does not call it out as having to be replaced. So here's the turbo, and you can see this rusty boat anchor of a manifold that we're going to pull off next. These are all 13mm studs, so you want to use a deep 13. Let's pop these off real quick. So at this point, you pull the gasket out. This is trash. And then we'll want to pull out the remaining exhaust manifold studs and replace them with the Full-Race Inconel studs. Then we'll access the oil feed filter with a 1-inch socket. This is really close to the alternator, so it takes a little finagling to be able to access this without having to pull the alternator, but it's worth it. Now that the studs are in place and everything's ready to go back together, we'll start by installing the fittings on the block. So first we'll do the oil feed fitting. We'll apply a little silicone lube to the O-ring, make sure that it doesn't tear upon reinstall. Pop that in place. Again, on the truck, you'll have an alternator here to work around, so a little tight space constraint, but it all fits. So you'll want to snug that up. And then we're going to move to the coolant supply fitting right off the block. So it is a O-ring to AN fitting, and again, applying the silicone lube all the way around. Pop it in place, and to fully snug this one up, you're going to need a 13/16 socket. And on the back of the head, we're going to pull out this Jiffy Tight fitting, 19mm, and get ready to install the billet AN to O-ring fitting. So again, silicone lube, and this one is a 17mm socket. Tighten that up and be ready to install the turbo. Now we're going to slide the gasket into place and prepare the exhaust manifold to go in. $13mm deep, that's all you need. Now we're going to take the nice fresh turbo, install a new gasket on it. Again, you want to make sure that the oil feed line is lined up with the oil feed hole, and the larger oil drain line is lined up with the oil drain hole. Do not install these backwards. No gasket maker, none of that, just a nice, simple, clean surface. We'll reinstall the T45 Torx. At this point, the turbo is ready for install. We put the new O-ring on the oil drain. We fully tightened the water fitting into the bearing housing on the block side. The water fitting on the top of the turbo, it's hand tight just so you can adjust it a little bit. The downpipe adapters are fully tightened, and the oil feed, oil drain combination has a new gasket, and the T45 Torx are tightened. So at this point, we're ready to put it in. You're going to want to get a brand new gasket, cannot reuse these. Please note that this is a left-hand specific, driver side specific gasket. It says LH right on it, as opposed to the right-hand side that'll say RH. And so you line up these locking tabs and pop it in place. And the last thing you're going to want to do before bolting this onto your truck is generously apply some anti-seize to the turbo to manifold stud hardware. If you ever have to service it again, anti-seize will make this thing come out really nicely. One of the more challenging aspects when installing the upgraded coolant lines on this engine is the space between the firewall and the back of the cylinder heads. And this is where the water from the turbochargers returns to the engine into the back of the cylinder head. If it's 11 to 14, you don't have a lot of space here. And so we already removed the intake manifold, and this will allow you to fit your hand right here and access these two fittings with the intake manifold removed. On a 15 to 16 Gen 1, there's actually quite a bit more space between the firewall and the motor. Furthermore, there's actually a lot of stuff on the 15 to 16s. There's evap hoses and fuel lines. There's a lot of stuff right here. So what you may find is actually when accessing the driver's side of the motor, you can come in from the passenger side wheel well and start this coolant fitting finger tight and then flop it over to the turbocharger. So you may find that when you're accessing this side of the engine, it's actually easier. Come through the passenger side wheel well, finger tighten this thing, and then flop it up into place. All right, at this point, we have the manifold installed, and we're getting ready to put the turbo in. And so manifold's tightened, the fittings are in the block in the back of the head, they're tight, and we're gonna start by installing the coolant supply line on the block. And so this is the 90 degree that goes into the block, the 45 goes on the turbo. And so what we'll do is we'll carefully thread this thing on now. It's a lot easier to do this with no turbo in the way, a lot more room, obviously. And we're just gonna finger tighten it. At this point, the coolant supply line is loosely installed. The coolant return line is loosely installed, manifold's fully tightened, and now it's time to install the turbo. So we're gonna start by applying some silicone lubricant to the O-rings for the oil drain. And then we're also going to apply the silicone lube to the oil feed male portion. And this is going to insert inside of the filter fitting that we replaced on the block. It has a fresh O-ring, so we just want it to glide in place and not get caught up. And then before we actually install the turbo, this oil supply 45, you're going to want to connect that, at least start the threads onto the turbo before threading or installing anything else. So just kind of start the threads here. It's real nice to do it when the turbo is out of the engine bay before it's fully fastened up. It's just really easy to get this thing started without risking any cross threading on it. Get that going. And then we can line up the oil drain into the block here. And then we can line up the oil feed into the filter. So just kind of gently line them up and then wiggle them around, push them in, and you'll get that secure pop as the O-ring slides into the bore. And what we want to do is finish tightening up the coolant -6AN fitting. It's an 11/16 wrench. And we want to cinch that up before we tighten that. So that's in place, and now we can start putting the T50 Torx bolts between the turbo and the manifold. At this point, the turbo should be cinched up, the coolant supply line is in place, and now the coolant return line can be positioned. So thread that onto the turbo, banjo bolt, and just kind of orient it in a nice happy spot so that it's not rubbing on the wastegate actuator. It's not hitting the back of the head or anything. It's just kind of happy, and you can tighten this one up. So coolant supply tight, coolant return tight, and we're going to add the two T45s to the oil drain and to the oil feed. And as you tighten this oil feed down, just put a little pressure on this. So as you tighten this, you're leaning on the fitting, just helping it guide it into place. But it'll lock in and seat itself on the O-ring. When it comes time to finishing up the driver's side turbo install, the AN fitting on the back of the turbo, coolant supply from the block to the back of the turbo, is tough to get to. And so what you use is an 11/16 crow's foot wrench. This is a little bit of a weird wrench, and it makes getting in here a lot easier. You pop the crow's foot on the end of extension and fit in the back. At this point, we have the driver's side all cinched up. The coolant lines, oil lines are all tight and in place. But we did not connect the downpipe, the intake tube, the charge pipe, or the wastegate. We're gonna do all that after the passenger side's ready. So now, at this point, happy with the driver's side, we're gonna move on to the passenger side and get that wrapped up. We'll show you that next. Now we're getting started on the passenger side, and we're going to begin by removing the three 10mm bolts that hold the AC compressor onto the motor. The reason that we're starting here is in order to remove the turbo, you have to get the coolant supply line out of the block. In order to get the coolant supply line out of the block, you have to unbolt the AC compressor. So three 10mm bolts, and then you can pry the AC compressor off the block and kind of pop the slip fit belt off the pulley. Imagine AC compressor's already been moved. This T45 Torx is holding a combination of the oil feed line, the coolant feed line, and once you pop this T45 Torx out, they'll be able to come loose. Next, we'll move on to the oil drain. It's the same thing, just another T45. Next, we'll move on to the coolant return. Spring clip out, wiggle that thing up. With the spring clip out, the thing can pivot up and down. If it's still attached in the back of the head, you can actually leave the fitting on and just kind of unscrew the Jiffy Tight. You don't even have to take the spring off because this whole thing's gonna get disposed of. Just get the hard line out of the way. We can now finish pulling the turbo off. So this is a T50 Torx. And at this point, the turbo is kind of floating, held in place by the oil lines. So you're going to want to gently massage it to get the oil lines out and the turbo free. Last, we'll use a 13mm deep socket, and we'll pull all the nuts off the exhaust manifold. With the exhaust manifold out of the way, now we're going to take out whatever studs didn't self-extract when we were pulling the nuts. 5mm socket. Now we're going to remove the oil feed filter and the coolant supply Jiffy Tight fitting. This uses a 13/16 deep socket, and Ford has a little notch in the block for the socket to fit into. Nice clean filter, what you want to see. And get this Jiffy Tight fitting out now. At this point, all the studs are out, fittings are out, everything's stripped down, and we're ready to begin the reinstallation of the new parts. So get your silicone lube and gently apply some lube all the way around the oil feed filter O-ring. Make sure it's nice and juiced up. You don't want an oil leak behind your alternator. Gently thread it into the block, and we're going to tighten this down. Again, it's a 13/16 socket. Apply some more silicone O-ring lube to the AN to O-ring fitting for the block side. This is the larger fitting of the two. Thread that one in, and again, go gentle. You don't need to go too crazy. The O-ring is going to do the sealing on this one. And then with the other two fittings tightened up, we're going to do the same for the rear head fitting. Silicone lubricant on the O-ring and cinch this up into place. So this is a 17mm socket. Now it's time to do one of my favorite things, which is to insert all of the Inconel studs into the cylinder head. So you'll notice this is a inverted Torx socket. It's a little different than the 5mm Ford stud. And you're going to use an E7 inverted Torx socket to get a really nice purchase on this stud during install. So in the name of saving some time, we're not going to show you every stud, but just get all your studs in place. At this point, Corey has installed all the Inconel studs using the E7 inverted Torx socket, and now he's going to place the gasket and then the manifold onto the cylinder head. All right, now we're going to start prepping the turbo for install. So we'll start with the T45 Torx to separate the oil feed, oil drain off the old turbo. We're going to reuse these per the Ford procedure. Carefully take it off, a little oil gets out, and we're going to discard this gasket. We'll clean this up, remove the oil drain O-ring, replace that, and then clean the oil feed up and get this thing ready for reinstall on the new turbo. To prep the oil feed, oil return line, hard line to go into place, you just need to take this old nasty O-ring out, get a pick tool in there, throw that thing away, clean the groove a little bit up. You can use brake clean. If it's not too bad, you can just use a rag. This one's not right. Pop a new O-ring in, include it with the install kit, and get that thing ready to go back in. Now we're going to install the coolant supply line on the passenger side of the motor. And this one's a little bit tricky, so pay attention. It can get confusing. You're going to first separate the tight radius 90 off the hose and thread it onto the block. And again, this fitting, O-ring fitting, has already been fully tightened, seated. That should be good to go. We're not going to worry about that. So now we're going to thread this thing on. Get a finger tight. And I realize there's an AC compressor here in real life, so I got a little bit more room to work with than you got. Thread that on, and then thread the hose on. Just finger tight to get everything into position. And what you want to do is you want to kind of bend this up so it's close to the manifold, but not touching it, not down here, not touching it. It's kind of floated up here. And that's going to get this position of this fitting just right. And now we want to try and lock this fitting in, and hopefully it never has to come out again. So this is an 11/16 wrench on this AN. What we'll do is get it on the flats. We're holding the fitting in place and just kind of start snugging it up. Make sure everything looks good. And I like to pull this off. Keeping the 11/16 on the AN fitting, we'll put a 15mm on the flat, if you can get it on. There we go. Get a 15mm on, you can really lock this thing in. It is a struggle. And if you're in the engine bay, you have even less room than I have to work with, so. Get this done. This is one of the worst parts of the install. Once that's ready, now we can start to thread the straight onto the tight 90. And we can lock this down. It doesn't matter the orientation because this swivels. 11/16 wrench, lock it down. That's your coolant supply line, fully oriented. Next, we're going to move on to the oil drain, oil feed combination. And different from the driver's side where we installed this on the turbo, we're actually going to install this on the motor and then install the turbo. It makes connecting this coolant line a lot easier. So first, apply some silicone O-ring lube. And then you go to the other side, the oil feed, silicone O-ring lube. Lather it up. We want to make it kind of pop into place without any dramas. So here we go. It's so easy when there's nothing pulling on it. Take two T45 Torx and we'll fasten these into place. Now for the fun part, we're going to install the turbo. And we've already installed the fittings, the banjo fitting on top, O-ring fitting in the back. And so what we'll do is we will now connect the coolant supply AN to the turbo line first. It is so much easier to start with this and then move on to the bolted connections. Now the coolant supply line is connected to the turbo. The oil drain hose is just kind of hanging out here. And so what we'll do is we'll begin to connect the turbo to the manifold. Fresh gasket is sitting in there, and lather these up with anti-seize. Don't be shy. Anti-seize is definitely your friend in a bolted connection like this. It gets real hot. T50 Torx, just kind of pop them in. And then once they're done, then we're going to come up from the bottom with a fresh gasket and line up the small hole with the oil feed and the big hole with the oil return. And then we'll drop a pair of T45 Torx screws into the flange. Now we are going to connect the coolant supply line first to the head, finger tight, then to the turbo, and then we'll cinch it all up. So get it on the back of the head. Again, if you got 11/14, there is much less room than on this 15/16. Again, finger tight. And just as a reminder, definitely need to make sure you have crush washers on either side of this banjo. 8mm Allen on an extension. And so you want to have it in a happy place. It shouldn't be anywhere near the wastegate arm. Doesn't need to be up here all tight. Just kind of hanging out nice and in a happy space. And we're going to lock this crush washer. At this point, we can go back to the head, 11/16. We can lock this AN fitting down. Then we can go to the turbo. This is the fitting we just tightened. Just lock it down. There you have it. At this point, both side turbos are fully installed. Everything's torqued and buttoned up. We reinstalled the starter. We reinstalled the AC compressor, and in order to reinstall the AC compressor, you actually have to use 2 zip ties to get the belt on the crank pulley. If you don't know how to do that, there's a ton of YouTube videos. And then we attached the downpipes and O2 sensors. So now we're going to check for leaks. Corey's filling the engine up with coolant, and we don't expect to have any leaks, but now's the time to check before buttoning it all up. So intake charge pipes are still off the vehicle until we've confirmed there are no leaks. Filled it up with water, there's no leaks, so we'll pop the battery terminal back on, which will allow us to turn the motor over without starting it, build oil pressure in the turbos, and check for oil leaks. So no coolant leaks, now we'll check for oil leaks. The procedure to build oil pressure in the engine is real simple. Wide open throttle, so push your gas pedal all the way down and do not lift that up. If you lift it up, the engine will start. So push the throttle all the way down and go to start. Right here, oil pressure gauge, we're just going to wait for it to build up. It might take a couple times. There we go, third key on. Do not lift the throttle. At this point, we're going to shut the engine off, or the vehicle off. We'll disconnect the battery again, make sure there's no oil leaks, and we'll button up the intake and charge piping. At this point, the turbos are fully installed. We checked that there's no coolant or oil leaks, so Corey is now buttoning up the intake and charge pipes. And on top of that, we're going to go and install a new set of NGK ruthenium plugs. We'll gap them to 025, 028. And then we're going to upload a tune from MPT. This truck came in with boost leaks, exhaust leaks. The exhaust manifold was warped. The studs were popped off. There was a charge pipe coupler that was completely separated. And downpipe leaks, like the whole thing was leaking. So this should feel like a whole new truck. And the fact that we addressed the studs with Inconel studs, the manifolds with Full-Race stainless manifolds, and a new set of turbos, the problems that this thing came in with will not happen again. The coolant line ANs will solve the coolant leaks. Like, this thing should be reliable for the long haul. So I hope this helps answer your questions. If you have anything else, please leave them in the comments below, and we look forward to seeing you on the next video.